Our guest lecturer today is, we're pleased to have Professor Alister McGrath with us. And in case you don't know, Professor McGrath is currently the Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University. He was previously Professor of Theology, Ministry, and Education at King's College London. He was also Professor of Historical Theology at Oxford University, and he holds 3 earned doctorates from Oxford, one in molecular biophysics, another one in systematic theology, and finally in intellectual history. He's delivered the prestigious series of lectures at the Bampton Lectures at Oxford in 1990, the Gifford Lectures at Aberdeen in 2009, and the Halcyon Lectures at Cambridge in 2009 and 10. He is the author of many books. Of particular interest to this group is his book, T.F. Torrance, An Intellectual Biography, 2006, which I would recommend to you all. He's also, this particular time, the sixth edition of his textbook, Christian Theology, an Introduction, is being launched here at AAR. Well, we're especially pleased, Professor McGrath, that you were able to be with us this morning, and we look forward to your paper. The title of his paper is Manifesto for Intellectual Engagement, Reflections on T.F. Torrance's Theological Science, 1969. Would you all welcome Professor Alister McGrath.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying that it's wonderful to be able to honor the memory of Tom Torrance in this way. And there's no doubt in my mind that Torrance is one of the most interesting and engaging British theologians of the 20th century. And I think it's quite likely he'll be one of the relatively few such theologians to find a readership in the next generation. I think it's fair to say that nobody really understands the mechanisms and factors which govern the reception of the theological past. We can certainly try and make sense of why some writers continue to be read today, where others have been discarded and forgotten, but we can't predict who the future will remember and value. Nevertheless, it seems to me that a core criterion is that a writer must continue to be useful. That is to say that a future generation finds a theological writer to engage meaningful questions in a satisfying manner. And that's one of the reasons why I'm confident that Torrance will continue to be remembered and used in coming decades. So why is Torrance so significant? Now, I suspect each of us here this afternoon will probably answer this question in slightly different ways. And I'd like to give you 4 reasons for valuing him as a theologian, although I'll be focusing on the 4th in my talk this afternoon. My first reason is this. Torrance, it seems to me, is an outstanding example of someone who consciously mediates the interpreted wisdom of the past. He's someone who's clearly nourished by the theological past, which he's appropriated and interpreted in his own theological project. And I'm sure that many of you will enjoy reading the works of C.S. Lewis, as I do, and professional theologians, I have to say, sometimes get irritated when I suggest that Lewis is one of the most significant theological voices of the 20th century, but I have to say I'm unrepentant about that. But interestingly, one of Lewis's most important reflections concerns how the present configures and incorporates the past, finding itself both nourished and critiqued by the wisdom of earlier generations, as Lewis puts it, as the clean sea breeze of the centuries blows through our mind. And Torrance, it seems to me, does this very well. He mediates to us in his own distinct way a theological appropriation of the wisdom of Athanasius, Calvin, and Barth. And whereas some theologians invite us to break free from the past, only, I think, to end up imprisoning us in the deficient and somewhat anemic theological framework of modernity, Torrance invites us to be refreshed and reinvigorated by the classics of the past, as he himself so clearly was. Now, our second reason for valuing Torrance builds on this. I'm a theologian of the Church of England, and I don't actually use the word Anglican anymore, as I don't find it particularly meaningful. But I don't theologize from... I theologize from within this tradition, but I don't theologize about it, if I can try and put it like this. I find that the rich theological tradition of the Church of England gives me a context and a framework which enables me to do theology in a creative yet accountable way, so I can draw on writers like John Donne, George Herbert, and Thomas Traherne, just to give a few rather splendid 17th century examples. But I don't theologize on behalf of that tradition. Now, Torrance is different. He's a leading representative of a reformed theological tradition. Now, this is not a tradition to which I myself belong, but it is a tradition which I treat with the greatest of respect, and at times, I have to say, feel envious at its formidable intellectual resources. And as I read Torrance, I see him doing two things. First of all, he theologizes out of this tradition, and secondly, he theologizes about this tradition. In other words, Torrance recognizes the Reformed tradition as offering both resources and a stimulus for theological reflection, while at the same time seeing himself as being part of a community of faith who, so to speak, is responsible for safeguarding and advancing its distinct theological tradition. Torrance, as I think you all know, is no passive recipient of the Reformed tradition, but he clearly sees himself as an active interpreter of this living theological tradition. And in part, I think that Torrance's theological strengths reflect this active and informed participation in this chronologically extended process of theological reflection within the Reformed tradition, with a clear affirmation of its distinctively Scottish embodiments and representatives. Now, let me just reassure you, I have no intention of jumping theological ships. I'm actually very happy in my present ecclesial location, despite its obvious shortcomings and difficulties. But my own base within the Church of England helps me appreciate the distinctive strengths of other such locations. And I hope that all of those of you who are confessionally reformed will allow me to pay you the compliment of acknowledging your obvious strengths, to which I think Torrance himself has contributed significantly. Now, the third point at which I think Torrance offers us a significant contribution concerns the interpenetration of historical and systematic theology. One, I think, of the many pleasures of being able to address this distinguished gathering is that you already know so much about Torrance that I don't need to provide you with a survey of his academic and professional career. I hope you already know all about this. So I'll merely highlight the importance of the fact that Torrance initially went to New College, Edinburgh, as Professor of Church History, 1950 to 52, and then transitioned at an opportune moment to the chair of Christian Dogmatics, which he held from 1952 until his retirement, his so-called retirement, in 1979. And it seems to me that Torrance's systematic theology involves engagement, criticism, and retrieval of the theological legacy of the past. He's a systematic theologian who incorporates historical theology into his reflections. And it seems to me that he's particularly significant in regard to Athanasius, Calvin, and Barth. I'm going to read you a very famous quote from Karl Barth, which I think many of you will recognize, and just make the point that Torrance might modify it slightly in terms of the personalities to be engaged, but he'd affirm the basic principles at stake. So this is Barth, but you can hear Torrance's echoes in this. With regard to theology, we cannot be in the church without taking responsibility as much for the theology of the past as for the theology of our present day. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Luther, Schleiermacher, and all the others are not dead, but living. They still speak and demand a hearing as living voices, as surely as we know that they and we belong together in the church. And reading some of Torrance's later writings, especially his late work, The Christian Doctrine of God, brings home to us the importance of this creative interplay of historic resources and contemporary reflection. Now, let's just agree that there are points at which Torrance's reading of the theological past may need nuancing. For example, if I could mention one small niggle on my part, I have concerns that the Christian doctrine of God at times seems to superimpose concepts grounded in contemporary scientific culture on an older theological vocabulary, and I think that happens in his discussion of the concept of perichoresis. And while I value Torrance's readings of Athanasius, Calvin, and Barth, I do have reservations about his reading of Augustine, especially his notion of Augustine's inherent dualism. But I can live with this, and I don't think Torrance gets Augustine wrong to anything like the extent that we find in the writings of Colin Gunton. Yet there is a fourth area in which I think Torrance has made a significant contribution, and that is to what we might call a scientifically engaged theology. And by this I mean a theology which is not defensive about its own distinct vision of its task and foundations, but realizes that it can only be enriched by an active and informed engagement with other intellectual traditions, above all the natural sciences. And I wish this afternoon to focus on this fourth strength of Torrance's theology. I began my academic career by studying natural sciences at Oxford University. I began my academic life by an undergraduate degree in chemistry, focusing in quantum theory, and then moved into the field of biological sciences for my doctorate, working in the Oxford labs of Professor Sir George Rader. And while I was doing my doctoral research, I persuaded the university authorities to allow me to read for a first degree in theology at the same time as doing my doctoral research. So, in the summer of 1978, Oxford very nicely awarded me a doctorate in the field of molecular biophysics, as well as first-class honours in theology. Now, studying theology at Oxford in the years 1976 to 8 was fascinating. And you'll be interested to know that Torrance was being discussed within the Faculty of Theology at Oxford around this time, with a special interest being expressed in his lecture, Space, Time, and Incarnation. But I have to say I didn't really pick up on this. I was more interested in the systematic theologies of Karl Barth and Emil Brunner. I had a real concern to develop intellectual links between Christian theology and the natural sciences, and at that stage thought that both Barth and Brunner might offer significant possibilities for interdisciplinary dialogue in this respect. I had taken a specialist paper in the field of science and religion while studying theology at Oxford, and I knew that there was much work that needed to be done. But I first began to read Torrance seriously when I moved to Cambridge University for 2 years in 1978 to undertake theological research, but also to prepare for ministry in the Church of England. I'd been elected to the Naden Studentship in Divinity at St. John's, Cambridge, which gave me access to Cambridge's excellent theological research libraries. And I'd been impressed by the example of two theologians I'd studied at Oxford, Wolfhard Pannenberg and Jürgen Moltmann, and both of them had begun their theological careers by focusing on episodes in the history of the discipline. And so I decided I'd use my time at Cambridge to research the development of the theology of Martin Luther. And Professor Gordon Rupp, who some of you will remember, who had recently retired as Dixie Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Cambridge, agreed to supervise my work in this area. And I eventually broadened this out to go beyond Luther to the doctrine of justification and also to the question of the intellectual origins of the Reformation. And my immersion in theology took me a lot longer than expected, simply because it proved to be so interesting. And it wasn't until about 1995 that I really began to engage the issue of Christianity and the natural sciences. But I began to read books about the relation of science and faith immediately, partly to get a sense of the questions being asked and the approaches being adopted. And so I came across Torrance's work, Theological Science, which I bought in Hefner's bookshop in Cambridge on the 2nd of June 1979. I know that because I put the date in the book, because in those days I was very poor, and every time I bought a book it was a major event, so I'd put the date in the covers. I devoured it. That's the only word I can use. I devoured it over the next 2 weeks. By the time I'd finished this book, I knew that exploring the relation of science and theology was going to be hugely stimulating. And I also knew that Torrance would be somebody I'd be engaging in detail and with both pleasure and profit. It was as if someone had turned a light on so I could see things in a new way. Torrance brought a new intellectual clarity and rigor to my reflections, allowing me to see connections and correlations which I otherwise might have missed entirely. And theological science offered me a manifesto for intellectual engagement, not just as science, but more broadly, in 2 ways. First, by encouraging interdisciplinary dialogue between theology and the natural sciences, but secondly, by providing an intellectual framework for its pursuit, which both created intellectual space for that interaction, yet which preserved the distinct identity of both fields of research. And that seemed to me to be really important. I first actually met Torrance in 1986 accidentally. I'd been invited to a conference of younger theologians to explore how we might think about the relation of science and theology. And we were told that some invited guests would be present, but no mention was made of any specific names. Now, the conference was to be held at our wonderful location. It was St. George's House, which is an intellectual retreat centre inside Windsor Castle. Now, the event was meant to start at 4 p.m., but some brainstorm made me write 1,400 hours in my diary. So the result was I arrived 2 hours early. And the conference organisers were mildly amused at my embarrassment, and they suggested I make myself comfortable while I waited for things to get underway. And they showed me into this rather splendid Victorian sitting room and told me somebody else had turned up early as well, so we might as well get to know each other. And so I met Torrance, who had made the long journey from Edinburgh to Windsor earlier that day. And we spent the next 2 hours talking about theological science. And while the rest of the conference was really quite interesting, there was no doubt in my mind as to its intellectual highlight. And it was that time with Torrance. And I went back to Oxford just saying, this is so exciting. I could see new ways of doing theology and science together, and that has stayed with me forever since. Now, Torrance's Theological Science was a book that I would return to at several points in my career. And from my notes, I can see I gave it a close reading on 3 occasions. As I've just told you, the first reading took place in June 1979, and what Torrance provided me with then was a theological map which allowed me to respect the fundamental difference between theological science and the natural sciences, while at the same time seeing them potentially as aspects of a greater human quest to understand reality. And what particularly impressed me about Torrance was that he had obviously understood some of the core themes of a scientific research culture, especially within the physical sciences. And my 2 subsequent rereadings of that work have persuaded me that the views about the methods of natural sciences and their theological relevance, which Torrance expressed in 1969, have stood the test of time remarkably well. Although he wasn't a professional scientist, Torrance somehow had managed to absorb the fundamental principles of the scientific method while focusing especially on some themes in modern physics. He doesn't engage the biological sciences and omits, I think, engagement with some areas of physics which I personally found theologically enriching, like quantum field theory, but those are just niggles. Torrance has clearly got the basics of the scientific method right and grasped its theological significance. And not all theologians, I have to say, have managed to do this. And if I could give an obvious example, I have to say that I find myself constantly frustrated by the late Wolfhard Pannenberg's misreading of scientific concepts and his failure to appreciate the fundamental scientific principle that research methods have to be adapted to the objects of investigation and they can't be determined in advance of that investigation. And Torrance has got that important insight clearly under his control. My second reading of theological science took place when I was preparing for my intellectual biography of Torrance early in 1998. Now, my first close reading of this book 2 decades earlier had been driven by my own yearning to try and sort myself out in thinking about science and faith. But my second was driven by an equally respectful yearning to understand the development of Torrance's theological vision. Above all, the question of how his distinct understanding of the relation of theology and the natural sciences actually emerged historically. How did Torrance develop those ideas? Where do they come from? And above all, what chronological account could I offer of their emergence? I think it proved relatively easy to give an account of the fundamental intellectual themes of Torrance's mature understanding of the relation of science and theology. What proved rather more elusive was filling in the fine detail of the process of chronological development that led to this viewpoint. Torrance actually published relatively little on the relation of natural sciences and Christian theology before theological science. Yet there are good reasons for thinking that at least some of his core insights on their relationship formed earlier in his career, particularly through his reading of Daniel Lamont's Christ and the World of Thought, 1934, which incidentally I would say is a work that's worth going back to. Lamont sets out a vision of a coherent theological engagement with intellectual culture, including the natural sciences, and Torrance clearly picks up on some of its themes. And through Lamont, Torrance discovered the writings of Karl, who held that Christian theology was under an obligation to interact with both the natural order and the natural sciences. For a theologian to ignore the issues thrown up by the natural sciences, according to Heim, is, I quote from him, a rebellion against God, who has placed us in a reality which inevitably confronts us with questions of this kind, and who has given us an intelligence which cannot rest until we've given some sort of answer to those questions. Now, I see the influence of Lamont on Torrance in the course of lectures on science and theology, which Torrance delivered while he served as Professor of Systematic Theology at Auburn Theological Seminary in New York State during the academic year 1938-9. And in those lectures, Torrance argued that science and theology should not be understood as two disconnected and non-interacting disciplines, as if there were kind of a hermetically sealed compartments in our minds, with interaction excluded as a matter of principle. Torrance highlighted the importance of, and I love this phrase, I'm quoting from him, a belief in the ultimate consistency of things as they are in themselves, for both science and theology. But how could this belief in the ultimate coherence of reality be affirmed? The scientist may well believe, as Torrance put it, that there is a principle of order in the universe which a natural science can uncover and explore, but can they account for it in the first place? No. Theology, on the other hand, is able to offer an account of that ordering seen from its own distinct perspective, which grounds it in the nature of the Christian God. Now, Torrance's approach to the relation of science and theology clearly mirrors that of Lamont, although Torrance develops some of his ideas in new directions. For Torrance, the natural sciences aim at accurate description and generalization, but cannot strictly be said to offer explanations which go beyond a simple redescription of the natural world. I quote from Torrance's lectures. Science cannot tell us anything about the ultimate origin or ends of things. If these questions are to be answered, they must be answered within the sphere of religion. So Torrance affirms at this early phase the essential complementarity of science and theology, providing, of course, that both are properly understood. Again, I'm quoting from Torrance's lectures. Science only informs us what light is thrown upon reality by the empirical observation of the facts of external nature. When science claims that this is all that can be said, it is no longer science, but a species of philosophical theory called naturalism. I find that very wise. Yet we find little from Torrance's pen on this topic in the 2 decades following those lectures. As many of you will know, Torrance's Theological Science was published in 1969 and represents a significantly developed and modified version of his 1959 Hewitt Lectures, delivered at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Yet I have to say that I could find virtually nothing to help me understand the process of development of that text during that 10-year period. There were tantalizing hints of that process of development at many points in his published writings, but I had no means of correlating these hints into a coherent narrative. So let me give you an example of the kind of hints I have in mind. This is an editorial that Torrance wrote for the July 1964 edition of the journal Theology Today, 1964, midway between 1959 and 1969. I'm going to read these words to you, and they offer us a tantalizingly brief glimpse of an earlier formulation of some core themes of theological science. I will hold these up to show you that I'm reading. So listen to what he's saying, and you will immediately hear an earlier version of the core themes of theological science. Science refers to the kind of knowledge which is forced upon us when we are true to the facts we're up against. Here we do not think in the way we want to think, but in the way we have to think if we are to do justice to the object we're investigating. The rational person, free though he is, thinks as he is compelled to think by the external world. Science is a rigorous extension of that rationality in which we distinguish what is out there from our own subjective images. In science, we ask questions and answer them under the compulsion of what is over against us, and so let our thoughts take shape in accordance with the nature of what we experience and under its pressure upon us. Scientific thinking is not free thinking, but thinking bound to its chosen object, thinking which develops special modes of inquiry and proof appropriate to the nature of that object. Because a special science is bound to its own field in that way, it will not allow another department of knowledge working in a quite different field to dictate to it on its own ground, either in prescribing its methods or in predetermining its results. Rather, does each science allow its own subject matter to determine how knowledge of it is to be developed and tested, for method and subject matter are not to be separated. Now, you'll recognize those thoughts. Those are precisely the thoughts that are developed in theological science 5 years later. Incidentally, those of you who are taught dogmatics at Edinburgh by Torrance may well recognize these words in another form, as they found their way into the first of his Edinburgh dogmatics lectures on the topic of Christology. So that was my second close reading of theological science. And the third took place in the spring of 2016 in preparation for this lecture this afternoon. And my agenda had changed again. Reading 1, sorting myself out. Reading 2, trying to understand Torrance's own theological development. But this time, this third time, was really to ask, what is Torrance's potential theological legacy? What is there in Torrance that a future generation will pick up on and want to use? And I've already highlighted some potential, some broad general areas in which Torrance might have some potential appeal to the future. And I want now to focus down on his vision of theology as a science, because for me, this is one area where I think Torrance speaks wisely and in ways that will be heeded by the theological future. Why did Torrance choose to engage the natural sciences in those lectures of 1959? Well, actually, Torrance does give us an answer. He tells us in 1946 that he developed a friendship with a prominent British physicist, Sir Bernard Lovell, who died a few years back, who served as the first director of Jodrell Bank Observatory. As I think many of you will know, Bernard Lovell was actually a cousin of Margaret Edith Spear, who Torrance married in 1946. And Torrance's ensuing conversations with Lovell raised lots of important questions. How did theology compare to the natural sciences? Could theology be described as scientific in any meaningful sense? And these seemed good, important questions to Torrance. And I have to say, he believed they had not been engaged particularly well by the theologian who he had come to regard as something of a lodestar, and of course I'm referring to Karl Barth. Torrance clearly felt that Barth's discussion of the important theme of theology as a science, to use his own words, fell somewhat short of what he had expected and what he believed to be necessary for the task of theological reflection. For Torrance, theology needed to advance through and beyond Barth. Again, his words from my interaction with Karl Barth, that very revealing reflection in that collection, How Karl Barth Changed My Mind, edited by Donald McKim. Torrance needed to, it was quite clear, theology needed to advance through, yet beyond Barth, to develop these themes properly, exploring, his words, the profound harmonies and symmetries of the divine grace, which express the inner logic of God's creative and redemptive operations in the universe. So, was Torrance right to be critical of Barth here? Well, I have to confess, I felt something similar myself as I tried to develop a theological framework to help me engage the relation of theology and the natural sciences during the 1980s. Now, as I'm going to make clear in a moment, Barth has some very important things to say in this area. But I have to admit I found Emil Brunner a rather more engaging theological conversation partner at this point, especially in his landmark work in anthropology, Man in Revolt, which tries to delineate a Christian account of the understanding of human nature, touching on the foundation and limits of the natural sciences. And I personally found his reflections of both Marxist and Freudian accounts of human nature to be rather interesting. And indeed, as some of you will know, we had a conference at Zurich back in September to mark the 50th anniversary of Brunner's death. And it became clear from the presentations given on that occasion, he's left actually a usable theological legacy behind him. But in fairness to Barth, I must immediately emphasize how helpful Barth is, in some ways at least, to a principled dialogue between theology and the natural sciences, mainly on account of his insistence that it's not possible to develop a universal method capable of being applied across disciplines. Rather, it's necessary to identify the unique object of Christian theology and respond in a manner that is consonant with its distinct characteristics. And although that basic idea can be found in Barth's earlier writings, I think you find the idea of particular clarity in the Göttingen dogmatics. When Barth, for example, criticizes the views of Hans-Heinrich Wendt, who'd argued that scientific knowledge was not determined nor dependent upon the specific nature of its subject matter. For Wendt, more or less the same research method was applicable in all intellectual disciplines. Now, Wendt's view had been criticized earlier by Martin Kahler, who insisted that the specific object of a discipline must determine its methods. And Barth rightly sides with Kahler, declaring it's essential to respect the unique subject matter of Christian theology and respond accordingly. Now, as I think you all know, Barth's vigorous defense of the distinctiveness of Christian theology prompted a response from the philosopher Heinrich Schultz, who argued for a universal method, a mathesis universalis, capable of being applied to all disciplines. Now, there's a lot more needs to be said here, but if I could just keep Oxford University's reputation in the air, I might refer you to my distinguished Oxford colleague Johannes Zackhuber, who wrote a rather splendid monograph on theology as science in 19th century Germany, which I think deals with some of these themes very, very well. Torrance builds on Barth's approach and sets out two basic principles. First, theology is to be understood as a human discipline that aims to use human reason to produce, to the extent it is possible, an ordered account of what can be known of its object. And it shares that desire to yield an ordered account of things with other sciences, including the natural sciences. And secondly, theology alone recognizes the self-revelation of God in Christ as its object, and hence as the sole foundation and criterion of its basic statements. Now, Torrance's approach here contrasts sharply with that of Wolfhard Pannenberg, whose theological project seems to mark a reversion to the modernist notion that a single research method can be applied to all disciplines. And it seems to me, regrettably, that Pannenberg's approach, which is quite similar to that of Scholz, shows a questionable grasp of the methods of the natural sciences, which is complicated and muddled by his rather idiosyncratic notion of a field. But Torrance, in marked contrast, has a good grasp of the methods of the natural sciences and a sure grasp of their theological relevance. Torrance argues that both these principles could be upheld while respecting the genuine differences between theology and the natural sciences. If it is to be agreed that all intellectual disciplines or sciences are under an intrinsic obligation to give an account of reality according to its distinct nature, kataphysin, very, very distinctive Torrancean phrase, then it follows that both scientists and theologians are under an obligation to think only in accordance with the nature of the given. The object that is to be investigated must be allowed a voice in this process of inquiry. And for Torrance, the distinctive characteristic of a science is to give an accurate and objective account of things in a manner that is appropriate to the reality being investigated. And both theology, theological science, and the natural sciences can be seen as a posteriori activities which respond to the given rather than as a priori speculation based on philosophical first principles. In the case of natural sciences, this given is the world of nature. In the case of theology, it is God's self-revelation in Christ. Now, Torrance here is making a point that is not in the least controversial. Physics, biology, psychology, just to mention a few examples, each have their own vocabularies and research methods and engage with nature at their own distinctive levels. And we might think, for example, of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who Torrance cites, who sets out very clearly this point about science being adapted to what investigates. Here's what Oppenheimer has to say. Every science has its own language. Everything the chemist observes and described can be talked about in terms of atomic mechanics, and most of it can be understood. Yet no one suggests in dealing with the complex chemical forms which are of biological interest, the language of atomic physics would be helpful. Rather, it would tend to obscure the great regularities of biochemistry, as a description of gas dynamically would obscure its thermodynamic behavior. The point he's making really is quite simple. Each natural science develops a vocabulary and a working method, a research method which is appropriate or adapted to its object. There isn't a universal scientific method. Each science develops procedures which are adapted to its own particular object. Now, I resonate very, very strongly with what Torrance is saying. But I'm going to bring another voice into the conversation at this point, which is one that may not be familiar to. And this is the social philosopher Roy Bhaskar, who died quite recently. Perhaps one of the most recent writers on the philosophy of the social sciences. And Bhaskar offers theology, it seems to me, a rich informing framework for its own exploration, as well as for a calibration of its intellectual possibilities in relation to other disciplines. So I'm going to read you a paragraph from him in which he talks about naturalism, in other words, the approach adopted by the natural sciences. What I want you to notice is his recognition of the distinctiveness of individual fields of research and the necessity of individual research methods for those distinct areas. Naturalism holds it's possible to give an account of science under which the proper and more or less specific methods of both the natural and social sciences can fall. But it does not deny that there are significant differences in these methods, grounded in real differences in their subject matters and in the relationships in which these sciences stand to them. Now, here's the really interesting bit. It is the nature of the object that determines the form of its possible science. And Bhaskar summarizes that in a little slogan: ontology determines epistemology. It's a good slogan. Torrance affirms the scientific character of theology while insisting there is no generalized or universal methodology that can be applied uncritically to all sciences. Like Bhaskar, Torrance affirms that the nature of the object determines the form of its possible science. Ontology determines epistemology, and in that each science deals with a different object, it's under an obligation to respond to that object according to its distinct nature, so that the methods that could be applied to the study of one object cannot be abstracted and applied to everything else. Each science, including theological science, develops procedures that are appropriate to the nature of its own particular object, in which, as Torrance puts it, it has solved its own inductive problem of how to arrive at a general conclusion from a limited set of particular observations. So for Torrance, theology has a legitimate position within the spectrum of scientific possibilities. We can speak of theological science. Now, clearly, Torrance is working with a number of assumptions, including a broadly realistic approach to the natural world. And Torrance's vision of theology rests on a fundamental conviction that there exists a real world outside the human mind, which is grasped, not constructed by human reason, and which engages with each aspect of that real world according to its own distinct identity and property. It does not lay down in advance how theology or any other science can do its work. Now, Torrance made this point, I think, particularly clearly in his Keith's lecture of 1971 at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Let me read to you what he says there. Scientific theology, no less than natural science, is concerned with the discovery of appropriate modes of rationality or cognitive instruments with which to enter into the heart of religious experience, and therefore with the development of axiomatic concepts with which to allow its interior principles to be disclosed, and in that light to understand as far as we may the rational structure of the whole field of God's interaction with man and the world he has made. So Torrance locates Christian theology within the broad spectrum of human attempts to engage the real world while identifying and respecting its own distinct nature. Christian theology can be understood as a theory in the sense of a way of seeing things, a speculative penetration into the structure of things, or, again, Torrance's words, a refined lens through which we see into the underlying order of nature, rather than try to determine in advance what it ought to be like. Now, I could say a lot more about this, but I want now, as I begin to move towards the end of this lecture, to stand back from the fine details of Torrance's approach and reflect on its broader significance. Earlier in this lecture, I suggested that one of the factors that may be involved in persuading a future generation to retrieve the ideas and approaches of a theologian from the past is a sense that this theologian offers them resources and approaches which help them to engage with significant questions, maintaining intellectual integrity in doing so. And I want to suggest that Torrance speaks plausibly and powerfully to those of us theologians who reject intellectual isolationism on the one hand and intellectual accommodationism on the other. It's a very important point. If theology is to maintain its significant position as a voice in contemporary culture and academic debates, it needs to have its own sense of identity and resilience, linked with both a capacity and a motivation for engaging others. Now, obviously, I need to clarify what that word engagement means. It could, for example, refer to an encounter between Christianity and some other discipline in which outcomes are framed in terms of securing victory or inflicting defeat or achieving superiority. And I have no doubt that such approaches to theology exist. But I don't believe they're right. As John Henry Newman pointed out many years ago, it's by being forced to engage with critical or secular alternatives that theology often comes to achieve authenticity. By engagement, I really mean a principled encounter in which Christianity maintains an openness, that is to say, a willingness to learn, perhaps even a willingness to correct itself as and when it makes mistakes. And as I survey both church history and the history of Christian theology, I think we see lots of mistakes, and I don't think those mistakes are limited to the past either. Here's why I think Torrance is so important. He offers us a framework which allows us to see theology as a legitimate, a distinct discipline with its own integrity and methods, which arise from the specific objects of its engagement. And for that reason, theology does not need to be defensive, in that it can take its own place within the broad spectrum of human scientific disciplines, each of which develops research methods and vocabularies adapted to the object of its investigation. And I would add, in the case of Christian theology, its adoration as well. Now, I have no doubt there are other theologians who might also offer us some such framework. And I want to suggest to you that Torrance's has a particular quality which causes it to stand out in a number of ways, not least his theological seriousness and his clear sense of standing within a stream of tradition with the potential to resource and inform the future. So in many ways in this lecture, I've simply paid tribute to Torrance, while at the same time singling out his idea of theology as a science, which I believe is good right now, but will retain that significance in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.